What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we're going to be talking about my must-start and my must-sit wide receivers and running backs as we head into Week 12 of the fantasy football season. If this is your first time watching this type of video, what we focus on is some good matchups at those positions and maybe some risky or avoidable matchups at those positions that I just don't like on this week's slate. So without wasting any more time, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, but let's start talking about some must-start and some must-sit running backs and wide receivers. All right, so we're going to kick it off at the must-start players first. I want to talk about the wide receivers, and the first player I want to talk about in this matchup this week is going to be McConkey. Now, McConkey is coming off of a very good week there in Week 11 where he played the Cincinnati Bengals on primetime, finished as the wide receiver 12 overall on the week in those half PPR formats. Now, he had 9 targets for 6 receptions and 123 yards, and now he gets a good matchup this week against the Baltimore Ravens. Right now, when you look at the Baltimore Ravens defense, they are currently ranked 32nd against the fantasy football wide receiver. They also are in a projected game total this week with 51 total points to be scored in this game. So there should be lots of points to go around, and the Baltimore Ravens defense has been pretty bad. Now, we do have the Los Angeles Chargers as 3-point underdogs in this matchup, and when you look at fantasy points above expectation, you look at the Baltimore Ravens defense, and currently they are giving up 8.6 fantasy points above the expectation. So this is going to be an incredible matchup for McConkey. Not to mention Justin Herbert and the Los Angeles Chargers have started to throw the football a little bit more over the last couple of weeks, and McConkey is certainly breaking out at the moment. So if you do decide to play McConkey here in your lineups this week, I would be looking at him as a top 15 wide receiver currently in my rankings, and somebody I would definitely be trying to get into my lineup. Now, moving on to the next player that I think we should be talking about this week as a must start, it's going to be DeVonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, DeVonta Smith is coming off of 2 back-to-back weeks where he really hasn't been that good, finishing as the wide receiver 75 on the week in Week 10 against the Dallas Cowboys and the wide receiver 55 in Week 11 against the Washington Commanders. But I'm looking at this matchup here for DeVonta Smith, and it's worth noting that he does have a hamstring injury at the moment. He did not practice on Wednesday. Typically, Wednesdays are veteran rest days, so at the time of this recording, we do not have Thursday's injury report. That is going to be very telling for the rest of the week. But I'm looking at the Los Angeles Rams, and that's who he's playing this week. They're currently ranked 26th against fantasy football wide receivers in a game with a 49-point projected game total. So we do believe that this should be a good matchup on paper for DeVonta Smith. There should be a lot of points to go around, and again, when we're looking at that fantasy points above expectation, that also checks out as well for DeVonta Smith, where the Los Angeles Rams are allowing 3.8 fantasy points above the expectation. So DeVonta Smith is certainly somebody who has been boom bust over the last couple of weeks, and I think if you've been playing him over the last couple of weeks, you might be feeling a little bit burned by DeVonta Smith at this moment in time. I think he's still somebody that we should be plugging into our lineups, and if you are deciding to play him in your leagues this week, I currently have him ranked as my wide receiver 18 on the week, so definitely somebody worth putting into your lineups, a guy that I'm looking at as a wide receiver 2 here this week against the Los Angeles Rams. But now that we've talked about the wide receivers, let's talk about some must-start running backs, and I want to kick it off with Brian Robinson Jr. of the Washington Commanders. Now, you look at last week, it was his first game back in the lineup after missing 2 games to a hamstring injury there in Week 9 and Week 10, and instantly he got a bad matchup, which was a bad matchup on paper against the Philadelphia Eagles, and he finished as the running back 13 on the week, posting 16 carries for 63 yards and a touchdown in that game. Now, I'm looking at this week's matchup against the Dallas Cowboys. Currently, Dallas is ranked 31st against fantasy football running backs. This game is projected to have 45 total points in that projected game total, and we are looking at the Washington Commanders as 10.5-point favorites in this matchup. Now, that type of game script should mean that there is going to be plenty of running opportunities for Brian Robinson Jr. in the second half of this matchup because they are going to be playing ahead and they are going to be running out the clock in this matchup. Now, again, when we reference fantasy points above expectation, this also checks out to be a good matchup because Dallas is currently allowing 3.7 fantasy points above expectation. So Brian Robinson Jr. should have the game script, should have the matchup, and should have the opportunity on tap here this week to finish as one of the better running back plays that we can have on the slate this week. And currently a player that I have as my running back 13 on the week, so definitely worthy of getting into your lineups, maybe even a low-end RB1, fringe RB1 type of guy, at worst a high-end running back too. Now, moving on to my next must-start running back, I want to talk about Rhamondre Stevenson of the New England Patriots. And now Rhamondre is coming off of a week there in Week 11 where he played the Los Angeles Rams. He had 20 carries for 73 yards, and he had a fumble in that game as well, but he also had 4 receptions in this game for 16 receiving yards. What we're seeing out of Rhamondre Stevenson right now is total bell cow usage. 24 touches in Week 11 is a ton, and you see the matchup here this week at Miami. Miami's currently ranked 24th against fantasy football running backs. This game does have a 46-point projected game total, and we do see the New England Patriots as 7.5-point underdogs, but Rhamondre Stevenson's usage in the receiving game makes me feel like he isn't going to be scripted out of this game. And when we reference that fantasy points above expectation, Miami is currently allowing 2.3 points above expectation, so there should be some extra opportunities for Rhamondre Stevenson to score here this week. I'm looking at the snap counts: 81% week 8, 75% week 9, 70% week 10, 76% week 11. He just has the majority of the workload in this backfield, and Drake May is obviously a very solid rookie quarterback, a guy who's up and coming. I think there's going to be plenty of opportunities, and I honestly feel like this Miami Dolphins game is going to be closer than that game script shows. So I would, if I was a betting man, going to be taking the spread on the New England Patriots here in this one for that plus 7.5. So if you are going to be playing Rhamondre Stevenson in your lineups this week, he's somebody that I would be trying to get into them, and somebody who's currently sitting as my running back 16 in my rankings heading into the weekend. But now that we've talked about some must-start players, let's talk about some players that have risky matchups and you may be wanting to avoid if you can afford to in your fantasy football leagues here this week. We'll kick it off at the wide receivers as well. I'm going to start with Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos. Now, Sutton has had a very good month of football, couple top 24 finishes, a couple top 10 finishes as well over the last 4 weeks. I think as Bo Nix has ascended, Courtland Sutton has also benefited from that as well. But I look at this matchup here this week against the Las Vegas Raiders, and right now the Las Vegas Raiders are ranked 5th best against the fantasy football wide receiver position. This is also a game that only has a 41-point projected game total, so there's not a lot of fantasy football points to go around in here, and the Denver Broncos are 6-point favorites in this matchup as well, meaning that they could lean on Javonte Williams in this run game in the second half if they do end up getting a lead. Now, when you look at the fantasy points above expectation, this does profile as a bad matchup as well. Right now, Las Vegas is allowing negative 4.5 fantasy points above expectations, so they are limiting fantasy football scoring opportunities here with this defense this year. The 24.5% target share is great for Courtland Sutton, but overall, this matchup just doesn't look like it's going to be that good on paper, and it does look like it could get out of hand for the Las Vegas Raiders. And if it does get out of hand, obviously, like I said, they will lean on Javonte Williams. Courtland Sutton is definitely a player that I think is on the rise for the back half of the season, but this is just not the matchup for it. If you are thinking of playing Courtland Sutton, which some people will still have to play Courtland Sutton, and I still think you can play Courtland Sutton, I just think you need to temper the expectations as the matchup is a little bit riskier. And this is a guy who's going to be outside of my top 20 wide receivers here this week, so a low-end wide receiver to play if you have to play him. Now, moving on to my next must-sit wide receiver, we are going to be talking about Tank Dell of the Houston Texans, and the story for Tank Dell this year has been very, very unimpressive. There really has only been about 2, maybe 3 weeks where you've been able to play Tank Dell in your lineups. The thing is, in week 8 and week 9, with Nico Collins off of the football field and Stephon Diggs off of the football field, there was a lot of hope for Tank Dell, and he did perform for fantasy football teams. So I think people are getting a little bit more comfortable with Tank Dell right now. I'm here to say we should be pausing that and pumping the brakes on Tank Dell. You look at the matchup here this week against Tennessee. Tennessee's currently ranked 3rd best against fantasy football wide receivers, and this is a game that has a 40.5-point projected game total, so really not a lot of points to go around in this one. Also account for the fact that Houston is an 8-point favorite in this matchup. Looking at the fantasy points above expectation, again, this also profiles as a bad matchup, as Tennessee is allowing negative 4.9 fantasy points above expectation, so that is definitely not great from a performance standpoint. Nico Collins back in the lineup has really hurt Tank Dell. You just saw it last week. I know we only saw 1 game of it, but immediately he was back to outside of the top 40 wide receivers in production. And I'm worried that without the big plays, without the big long touchdowns that Tank Dell was getting at sometimes last year, Tank Dell is still just very much a boom bust option that really doesn't have much value in your lineups as a consistency play. For me this week, I am going to be viewing him as my wide receiver 30 in my rankings, and a very risky one at that. So I think there are plenty of other opportunities for you to play some other guys, maybe some guys like Quentin Johnston, or even a guy like Rome Odunze, who I think are much better matchups for this week here in week 12. So now that we've talked about the must-sit wide receivers, let's talk about some running backs that have some risky matchups this week. And I hate to do this one, but I think that Chuba Hubbard is a guy that I am considering sitting this week if you have the flexibility to do so. I know it's probably going to be very hard to sit him in the running back position this week with all of the bye weeks, but I'm looking at this matchup for Chuba Hubbard coming off of a very very, very good stretch of games. Really, since week 3, he's had multiple top 10 finishes. I think he's had about 5 of those at that. He also had multiple top 24 finishes as well, coming off the bye week. The problem is he gets Kansas City this week, who is the #1 defense against fantasy football running backs, in a game with a 43-point projected game total, where the Carolina Panthers are 11-point underdogs. Now, you look at that fantasy points above expectation, which I've liked talking about so far this year. This is by far the toughest matchup in fantasy football at the moment, where Kansas City is allowing -8.6 fantasy points above expectation. That is by far the best number of any NFL team in the league so far this year. So it is a very, very tough matchup. Chuba Hubbard, he's still going to get the majority of the workload. I mean, for goodness sake, he saw 88% of the snaps last week, but you also have to account for the fact that they did say that Jonathan Brooks is going to be in the lineup for the first time this year here against the Kansas City Chiefs. I don't expect him to be taking anything away from Chuba Hubbard, but it is another guy that's going to be in the rotation. Mix it with the tough matchup and a lot of these other things considered, I think that Chuba Hubbard has a lot of risk this week. I'm definitely not confident that he is going to give me the boom weeks that he's been giving me over the last 2 months. And this is a guy that I currently have as my running back 20 in my rankings this week. So there are definitely plenty of other options that I would play above him. Obviously, you're still probably going to have to play him, but I'm just telling you, temper the expectations on Chuba Hubbard this week, because the matchup does not look pretty for the Carolina Panthers. And now let's go to my last and final running back that I think is risky this week, and we're going to talk about DeAndre Swift of the Chicago Bears. Now, as I'm saying this, I did mention earlier in this video that we have not got the injury reports for Thursday. This one is going to be very critical for DeAndre Swift, because he did not practice on Wednesday heading into week 12 against the Minnesota Vikings due to a groin injury. So we want to keep an eye on that one. If Swift is unable to go, pretty much all of the data that I'm going to project is also going to be applicable for Roschon Johnson, so we will use that as well. But I just wanted to mention that as we head into the week. DeAndre Swift's had a very good couple months of the season as well, kind of like Chuba Hubbard. Multiple top 12 weeks, a couple top 24 weeks, but he's been very good for fantasy football teams. I just am nervous about him this week because Minnesota is currently ranked 3rd against the fantasy football running back position. This is a game that is projected 39 total points, so there is definitely not a lot of points to go around in this one, and we do have the Chicago Bears as 3.5-point underdogs. Now, obviously, DeAndre Swift, he does get it done in the air, so the game script is not necessarily something that I'm too worried about, but when I'm looking at the fantasy points above expectation, we've talked about it so far this year, how Minnesota has been very vulnerable against wide receivers. They've been very good against running backs. That points above expectation number is going to be -5.4 for the Minnesota Vikings, so it is very tough for DeAndre Swift, who is coming into this game banged up with a groin injury. Also, you have to account for the fact that last week we did see DeAndre Swift's snap percentage drop down to 57%. We saw some more Roschon Johnson with the new offensive play caller in the building for the Chicago Bears. That could maybe be due to the groin injury, but it is also something we should be paying attention to heading into the weekend. So there's really a lot of red flags and yellow flags kind of surrounding DeAndre Swift here this week. I do think he's a guy who does possess a lot of risk going into the weekend. So if you are thinking of playing DeAndre Swift, he's a guy that I have outside of my top 20 running backs, more so a fringe running back to play this week if he is even able to suit up. But like I said, keep your eye out for that injury report, because we could get some more clarity on if he's going to be available to go this weekend. And if he is, this is a risky matchup, so I might avoid DeAndre Swift if I can. All right, so there you have it. There's my must start and my must sit players at the wide receiver and the running back position as we head into week 12 of the fantasy football season here this week. As always, if you enjoyed today's video, hit that like button for me. Also, make sure you are subscribed to the channel and go join our free Discord. We do have a free Discord linked in the description for you to go join a community of 250 plus people that want to talk fantasy football with you 24/7, 365. But with all of that out of the way, I have nothing else for you guys today, so I will see you on our next episode. Until then, peace out.